Hello, fifth graders. This is our second day of the Explorers' Triumphs and Troubles. We are now reading about Asia. So let's get right started. Before we start reading, there's some things to think about. Some things that are going to be themes that are going to come up in all our chapters, and some things that are kind of specific to the Asia region. So I want you to keep in mind both sides of the story. That's something this book really focuses on. So you're going to have the perspective of Marco Polo and his crew, and you're also going to have the perspective of the people in China. And I want you to think about what both sides might be thinking about. What motivated or what made him want to? What motivated Marco Polo to go to China? What dangers were there when the British went to Tibet? Thinking about there can be a lot of dangers associated with being an explorer. And think about how an explorer might be viewed as an invader. This is a theme that is going to come up over and over again in this book. How an explorer might be viewed by some as an explorer, but others as an invader. And some vocabulary words we have: expedition. And expedition is defined as a journey for a specific reason, for a specific goal in mind. Reparations are something that are paid from one party to another party in exchange for something. And territory is just a piece of land that is claimed by someone. All right, so let's get right started reading then with those things in mind. All right. Marco Polo and the Silk Road. Imagine being just 17 years old and setting off for the other side of the world. Your dad, whom you only met 2 years ago, and your uncle are with you. You can see here the route that was taken. The Polos traveled from Venice to China along the Silk Road. The route was named after the valuable Chinese silks that were traded along it. The Silk Road to China. That 17-year-old was Marco Polo, and the year was 1271. Marco Polo and his companions were setting out from Italy on the Silk Road, an ancient trade route between Europe and China. After many adventures, they finally reached the Chinese Emperor Kublai Khan's palace in about 1275. Marco was a very clever young man, and he eventually became Kublai Khan's advisor. Unlike other foreigners, Marco was allowed to travel throughout China. In fact, Kublai Khan found Marco's advice so useful that 17 years passed before he was allowed to return home to Italy. The travels of Marco Polo. When Marco Polo did get home, he found there was a war between his hometown of Venice and nearby Genoa. He was taken prisoner by the enemy. While in prison, he met a writer named Rustichello da Pisa. Da Pisa wrote a book of Marco's experiences called The Travels of Marco Polo. The book told readers about the people and the customs of China, and it was a hit throughout Europe. As a result, Marco Polo became one of the world's most famous explorers. Triumph. Marco Polo's book inspired traders to follow the Silk Road. The growth in trade brought wealth and new ideas to Europe, China, and the places in between. Or trouble. China was a secretive place where foreigners were not allowed to travel freely, but the travels of Marco Polo told people all about China and its customs. Imagine how the people of China would have felt if their enemies had used this knowledge to attack them. Journey Fact File, 1271 to 1295. Length of route, up to 6,200 miles. Time for journey, over a year. Dangers. This is one of the things we were thinking about. Bandits. Wild animals, desert sandstorms, cold and snow in the mountains, hunger and thirst. All right, keep thinking about those different perspectives as we continue on. All right, expedition to Tibet. In 1903, so this is significantly later, a British expedition to Tibet set out from India, which at the time was ruled by Britain. Little was known about Tibet, as foreigners had been banned since the 1850s. Francis Young Husband led the expedition. Young Husband was not only an explorer, but he was an officer in the British Army and took 3,000 soldiers with him. Here you can see the route. All right, let's look. Reasons for the expedition. Officially, Young Husband was going to Tibet to discuss a trade agreement between British India and Tibet. and to explore the country. However, there was another reason for this journey. British authorities in India thought Russia wanted to control Tibet. The British thought Russia was sending weapons to Tibet that could be used to stage an attack on British India. Explorers became invaders. The Tibetans did not want the British army in their country. They saw the British expedition as an invasion, which was what it soon became. To stop the British, Tibetan forces tried to block the road to the capital, Lhasa. But the Tibetans were armed with old-fashioned weapons. Instead of turning back as peaceful explorers would have done, the British army opened fire with guns. The conflict was not balanced. Hundreds of Tibetans were killed, but very few British soldiers died. Journey Fact File, 1903 to 1904. Distance 223 miles, in a straight line from Bangkok to Lhasa, much farther on foot. About 10,000 people, including 3,000 soldiers. Dangers: attacked by Tibetan forces, freezing temperatures, snow, ice, and altitude sickness. Scorched Earth. The Tibetans began to realize that they could not fight off the British and their powerful weapons. Instead, they began a Scorched Earth campaign where they destroyed anything the British might find useful. The villages were deserted, supplies were carried away, hidden, and crops were burned. The Tibetans thought that with nothing to eat, the British would go away, but this was not successful. The British had brought supplies with them, and they were able to fish in Tibet's lakes and hunt wild animals. A trade agreement. The British finally reached the Tibetan capital, Lhasa, on August 3rd, 1904, by which time all the Tibetan leaders had fled in fear. Young husband forced junior Tibetan officials to sign an agreement that said the British could trade in Tibet. It also said Tibet had to pay reparations to make up for attacking the expedition. Until they were paid, the British would occupy part of Tibet's territory. Triumph. Leading the expedition across icy plains and throughout the high mountain passes showed the great leadership skills. And young husband was a patriot, trying to keep British India safe. He showed the Tibetans that siding with Russia was a bad idea. Or trouble. The Russian plan to control Tibet never existed, so the expedition was pointless. Even at the time, young husband was criticized for using powerful weapons against untrained, poorly armed Tibetans. Buildings were torn down, crops were ruined, and part of the country was occupied. All right, that is it for Asia. The next part will be about the Americas. Just circle back based on what we read. We're going to look at those focus questions one more time. Now, after we read, think about it. Think about what motivated Marco Polo to go to China, the perspective of Marco Polo and his crew, as well as the perspective of people in China. What dangers were there when the British went to Tibet? And think about how an explorer might be viewed as an invader. All right, great job, you guys.